Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. Okay. We are on page 1349. We finished 1349. Aleph Shin Mem Tes. And with that, we finished the long 559 pages that began on page 790 in volume 2 in explaining the Torah of the Magid Anasei Lecha Shtei Chatzeitzres. But in the process, it wasn't just an explanation of the Magid, it was a full-blown discussion on the transformation of the Tzimtzum and how we take a dark world like ours and we climb and retrace the steps and connect to the divine transcendent energy all the way to highest levels of transcendence. Like in the pasuk v'yadaita yem v'shavesel avecha ke'avayu elikim, and all the levels that he explained, 3 main levels of the elevation of avayu elikim. One is the rotzev v'shuv of biyah, of the yesh of biyah that is concealed, the divine is concealed, and it's yearning and longing through avodah to connect to Atzilus. The second is the kelim of Atzilus connecting to an air that's even higher, an energy that's higher than Atzilus. And finally, the third, the air itself, connecting all the way to the etzem and pnimius air, to the highest levels before the tzimtzum. And all this is not einoid. This is the regular, as he called it, in the parentheses on the bottom of 1349, said einoid is beside etzem hakeli, that the keli itself also has a root in the Elikim itself, and the Kelim itself have a root all the way in the Helam Ha'atzmi. But the Amshacha B'Seid V'Adraga Yidei Aveda, that goes from the bottom up, on this it says V'Yadaiti Avei Elikim, that's an area that relates to existence. So we're not talking about the Etzem, the Helam Ha'atzmi, in general, in the process of the usual Aveda. He did discuss it because ultimately, that's also part of the process, ultimately, especially through Tshuva, that we transform the very darkness, the very gvuris itself in their root. But generally, the Avodah is in the Giluyim of going from level to level, from concealment to more Gilui, more Gilui, more Gilui, as we discussed at length. And he's concluded, V'zel tachlis Avodah the Tefillah, that's the ultimate purpose of davening, which is halah, like we spoke, Aramim Chelekai HaMelech, from the bottom up, that we go from Elikim, from HaMelech, from the divine within existence, and we climb Mamata L'mayla Yesh to Ayin. You go from the Yesh to the Ayin. So to draw down the Eid Ein Sof as it relates to existence, because at the end of the day, it's coming from our effort. So we're internalizing it. And all the way to have the Eid as it is, even without any garment, without any concealment. So that's a tremendously high level. That's ultimately what we will achieve through all our work when we bring the Geula. There'll be the additional step of Einoid that the Yesh itself and the Keli itself will reveal the Helam Ha'atzmi. But that's like a different track in addition to the regular process. I will also point out that a similar theme was discussed earlier on a page, which we talked about then, but now becomes a lot clearer. Let me refer you to that page where he talked about Birurim. Let's see. Let me find it. There's a very interesting paragraph. Oh, it's a while back. Here we go. Page 1301. On 1301, when he was talking there about the same idea that there's neshamas of Ma, the Amshacha of Ma is from the top down, illuminating something, that the light is transforming the darkness from above. Here we're talking Mamat L'mayla Shem Ban, and like he said there, the Shem Ban from the bottom up, like Tefillah. So that from the bottom up includes the transformation from darkness from within. The ultimate is Einay, like we just said. But generally, the Avodah is Nasei D'Vadroga. That's the order. B'chol Avavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, B'chol Meidecha. Or we start in the morning Moeda'ani and we end up with Shemoneh Esrei. It's climbing a ladder. Or in the words that we used earlier, mutfa, murgish, muskel, you start off first with behavioral, emotional, cognitive, as you grow to absorb and connect to higher levels of godliness. So there, in an interesting paragraph on 1301, he said that when he spoke, he says, so the highest level, he says, is when the body itself will rise in tchis hamesim, which is the idea then the neshamas aban, their main work is transforming the chemer, the crassness of the world, the aved of the eved. That's where he spoke about, if you recall, vayorim kerem shiche, the highest level that we're elevating from the bottom up. Through that, malchus will go all the way to remus asmus and atzmus ein sof. So when they work from the bottom up, you reach all the way to the highest levels. Okay. Then he said, Vagam, even though we learned earlier that the man is higher than Birudim, because Birudim only draws down an area that relates to existence. Like we're talking about here, Birudim, because Birudim, you take the world and you reveal the sparks within it and you elevate them. So what are you drawing? The energy that relates to existence. Yes, it's drawing from very high levels. So he said there, an interesting point, which is very relevant to us here. I just want to read a few lines from there. He said, what that means is that Birudim, which are in an orderly, progressive way, that's what Birudim are. You work on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The process is that we go in a very orderly, progressive way. We're redeeming and elevating the sparks in our lives. What does that mean? In what you eat, in what you drink, in your business, in your leisure. The Aveda of refining this world and transforming it. So that's, he says, b'chinas hisaps. Mashenken l'mayla b'chinas habirudim. Mashenken l'mayla b'chinas birudim. Whereas, for example, a tzaddik is not involved in the engagement of transforming the crassness of this world, even though we learned that he engages with this world, but he's not bound by it, if you remember. He's not nitfas. So he says, therefore, he fundamentally is on a higher level. It's a higher level of gili. So if you're talking about purely firepower, we learned Yashar, Shema, has more energy. There's no question it's higher level of because it's coming from a higher level. It's not engaged, it's not involved and as much immersed in the materialism of this world. To some extent, yes, but it's still from the top down. Whereas Ban is coming from the bottom up. So that is in the pure, if you're talking about purely in what level of gili it is. So obviously a tzaddik is on a higher level than a Beinani. However, that's in quantity. But in the qualitative involvement, the etzem inyan of being involved in Bidurim, that you're involved in taking a material world and materialism and turning it into becoming a container to godliness, which is antithetical to the nature of the Yesh, because the Yesh on its own is involved in its own interests. And you reverse that. Remember, we spoke about daily, Maisa saying, you're making from Yesh Ayin is greater than making from Ayin to Yesh. So he says to make Halil Kuz, that you mamshech atzmus, because that's the kavanah atzmis. So at tzaddik, as much as his giluim is higher, but that idea of coming into a material world and transforming it from the bottom up, so it's not about how high the gilui is. To put it in simple English, when a person who is not necessarily a very high level soul, but in his personal life, he makes a shift from his natural inclination, one small shift. That shift can achieve more and reach higher levels in the core essence than someone who's a much more giluyim. For example, like he says in Tanya chapter 15. What does he say? The Gemara says in Menachos that who's called an Eved Hashem, who's called the Eved Elikim, someone who serves God, and someone who's lo yavod, not serve. He gives an interesting example. So the Gemara talks there about the custom in the time that when they would learn, whatever they learned, they would review 100 times, 100 times. That was the custom. That was their routine. That was the habit. Says the Gemara. And the Alter Rebbe explains that a person who learns something 100 times is not considered an Eved Elikim. Why? Because it doesn't take work. It's your habit. It's a good habit. It's a beautiful habit. It's a routine of Gedusha. We're not talking about a bad habit, but it doesn't take any effort. That's what you do as a regular. When the person learns 101 times, he goes one above his regular routine. That one, he says, qualitatively outweighs the 100 that he did, even though you can't get to 101 without 100, because he went beyond his nature. So for a person who, for him, the first time he's learning Gemara, he breaks his head to understand one line in the qualitative touching of Atzmus, that can have more value than someone who learns 100 pages of Gemara. Same idea. And because he does it easily. That doesn't take away from his credit. It's better than he's learning Gemara than doing something else. But in the context of breaking yourself, of taking a yesh and changing its nature and directing it toward godliness, that, he says, qualitatively is far deeper. That's why I wanted to bring it in here, because this complements a lot what we're learning now. So we shouldn't assume that just because we say it's shaykh la'ilim is that it means it doesn't have tremendous power. Because it's not about, we're not talking about the firepower, how much energy there is. We're talking about that effort and the shift that it creates. So that he says, nimsha bechinas ha'atzmus. Al derech shen isbar lil, I'm reading from page 1301. The mashakeli mamshech ere ide zichuk v'tiken hakeli shenasa bechinas keli yesod al ha'er nimshech ere sheberach hakeli. And he compares it to this whole idea that when the keli becomes more refined, so then it's drawing an that's commensurate to the container. But when you take the keli and it itself becomes okay, the truth is this is already the level of einaid. So I don't know if it fits exactly what we're describing. We are talking about the progressive aliyah step by step. But the main point I wanted to make was this, that the fact that the energy may be commensurate to us does not take away from the fact that it's touching a very deep place above. Let's see what else is maybe relevant there. Yeah, that's the point. The same thing birurim. Even though birurim may not be necessarily the level of, we're talking about Helam Atzmi, but the mere fact that you're involved in it has that power. And then he goes on to explain what means Seder Hadraga, the two ways, what means then the progressive order. And he says one is because the process is one that simply goes from step to step. That's the first thing he says. Because first, like he says, that first you're not completely refined, and slowly you have to remove the waste as one gets more refined and elevates in their avodah. Talks about reshus and mitzvahs. It's worthwhile reading. I'm not going to go through the whole thing right now. And then he says the second reason it's called is because ban poel abitl be'etzem husayesh yesim b'shema. That shema is really the seder v'hadraga, because there you're going step by step and bringing more revelation into the picture. But that qualitative shift of the bitl me'etzem ha'mahus comes from ban, who be'etzem yesh. The einem be'inyan the seder v'hadraga. So though there is also, we climb step by step, obviously from Shem Ban, but that element of a shift that you turn from Yesh Ayin has something that is greater than just a progressive order. That's what he adds. Yeah. I just wanted to add that into the picture. One more thing I want to say before we continue. Well, actually, I just was going to sum up. So to sum it all up, what we've learned so far, and I want to re-emphasize that this is all based on, and I'm finding the more I look into it, the more I see how much it's based on the Maimer of the Mittler Rebbe called, to understand the idea of Mashiach, so there's a long Maimer, over 100 pages from the Mittler Rebbe, that he talks about Mashiach doing tshuva, causing tzaddikim to do tshuva. He's coming to bring the tzaddikim to tshuva. So there, a lot of the themes here that began all the way from the beginning of volume 3 are based on that. And namely, Havai Yechata Merivav, which is the idea of the shattering of the enemy And then comes what he said, V'niyitan eiz lemalkei, v'yarim kerem meshiche, and he explained those are the three stages. Shattering the enemy is the first sweetening of the gvura, but it's through shattering. It's not through transformation. It's overriding. It's neutralizing the bitter water with the sweet. The second level is transforming, but it's coming from above, from Shema. That's v'yitan eiz lemalkei. And the third, v'yarim kerem meshiche, is the etzem, that you actually reveal that the gvura itself is transformed into its root. All that is based on this Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. So when you look back now, and I look back at the last, what shall we say? We started this volume began essentially 1207. Now we're at 1349. So we're talking about 142 pages, right? Yeah. So these 142 pages, if you recall, you go back when he started talking about Einoid, the transformation. He started first Havai Yechatim Rivav. Then he went over to the concept of Gan Eden and Chias HaMesim, Gan Eden and Elam Haba rather. The Gan Eden ultimately is the revelations, and Elam Haba we start reaching the etzem of the mitzvahs and their root. All that is from the Maimer from the Mittler Rebbe. And then the third point, the Asal of Asavat Tzadikai B'Tiyufta, is also all based on that Maimer. The idea of the tzaddik, the tshuva of the tzaddik is Shema, experiencing Shem Ban, where he also has an element of tshuva, but it's not quite like the tshuva of the Baal Tshuva, which is literally transforming from the bottom up. Tzaddik is still level 2 of the sweetening. So many of these themes are directly from that Maimer with a lot of elaboration, and there are actually ideas there that the Rebbe Rashab does not quote. So I've been looking at that as well to see if anything we can derive from there. But this is the essential gist of it. So
which Maimer is that, Rabbi?
Again, Havai Yechatim Rivav, and the Gan Eden and Elam Haba. Mutfa Murgish Muskel is actually not really developed in that Maimer by the Mittler Rebbe. I don't think he even mentions it. That's the Rebbe Rashab's elaboration, but definitely Gan Eden Elam Haba. And then from that, he goes back to mitzvahs. If you remember Yud Kei Vav Kei, the Mem Tzadik and the Yud Kei Vav Kei of the mitzvahs is also from there. And I actually marked up my Ayin Beis with notes exactly which page is taken from which section. So I have it all pretty much marked up. So when we went back to the page 1254, and especially, just a second, let me just see something, 1 second, please. Mm-hmm. Just a second, please. So, and the whole idea of Simcha Shal Mitzvah, and that the Kalim are rooted all the way in the source, this is all from the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. Again, the Rebbe Rashab, not Rishimu. Rishimu, the Rebbe Rashab himself added, and a lot of other points that are added. I'm not going to go through a full comparison right now.
What's the Maimer?
Dense and complicated. I'll when I finish, I'll take questions. Oh, what happened? Just a minute. I just want to see exactly. Just a moment, please. Yeah, the Yudke, the Schar Mitzvah, the whole thing with Schar Mitzvah, and the 5 things that we have Me'ein Elam Haba today. All that is the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, yeah. And also that idea of Havaya Chatim Rivav, that the Havaya there is the Gershayim, the 2, what do we call it? The 2 intonations.
Cantillations.
Cantillations, yeah. So that's also there in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. and all the way to where we are now. Ultimately, as I said, the whole process. I'm still doing comparisons, but we shall talk about it more as I figure out more about it. Now, in the concluding part of all of this, the Rebbe Rashab finished up with going back to the Maggid's Torah, which briefly is that not only Atzilus is united with godliness and higher levels of godliness, but also Olam HaKisei, the Dmus, when Yecheskel saw Al Dmus HaKisei, Dmus Kemara Adam, L'mayla, that on the likeness of the Kisei, the world of Bria, he also draws down the likeness of man, of Atzilus. That's the Aveda Mamata L'mayla, that after God created the world with all its tzimtzumim and concealments, we reverse the process. And that's the process going from step by step, and ultimately reconnecting and reuniting, as he explained, the 3 levels of reuniting through the refinement of the containers. That you come is dachus godla ma'ala mikol ha'elamis. So first you come to the refinement of biyah, kisei, connecting with Atzilus. Then that the kelim of Atzilus connect with an that's higher than them. That's his dachus, until the point they become achdus, imoy yizbarach. And that's the aveda b'primis kavana, primis shebemayach, or ava b'tainugim. That's the connection all the way to the highest levels of oir, to the point where there's an exclusive bonding and union between God thinking nothing but us, and we think nothing but except by God. So it's a complete fusion that we have no distractions, complete joining, as he explained on top of page 1349. And U'Mesayim, then the Maggid ends with the Shtei Chatzetzes, that these are the 2 trumpets, Chatzitzuras, which refer to the human being and godliness, or in the human being, Aleph and Dam, Aleph representing the godly part of our lives, our souls, Dam representing the body part and the animal soul part, and joining the 2 together because that's what the refinement accomplishes. That there's a total joining between the Eiris and the Kelim, because the Eir's intention is not complete without the Keli, and the Keli is not complete without the Eir. They both need each other like twins, where they become one. Siyur Tzura Shlema. And this is the level of Eir that relates to us, because it's coming from our work from below. However, qualitatively, it touches the highest levels, and especially when you go to Ein Oid, then the very Keli, the very darkness itself, is sweetened from the root, which is the level of Helema Atzmi, as he explained. So this is now finished, essentially, the idea of Tefillah, Lamata Lamaila. But now, what we're missing is, what about the levels of Eir that are higher, that don't relate to us? The levels of Eir that reflect the highest levels of godliness that are beyond us. So now he's going to explain, and this is an introduction to the next section. He's going to explain this is where Torah comes in. That he spoke about back before page 790 in volume 2, before you get into the Maggid. So the Maggid is primarily a discussion of Mamata Lamaila. But now we're going to go to Torah, and Torah gives us the image of the divine from above. Not that the Keli is creating an image in the Eir, but that the Eir is creating an image in the Keli, like he pointed out and said very clearly in the bottom of page 1348. Okay. The Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, I referred to a number of times already. It's called La Sovet Sadikai B'Tiyufta, to understand the idea Mashiach comes to bring tshuva. It's printed in Maimori Admur Adzoy Kuntresim. It's a sefer. You can find it in Hebrew books and other places, and that's where it is. And it's printed there. You want the page? The page there is in that book. It's on page 281 and on. As I said, it's a very long mimer that goes on for many, many pages. As I said, I've been comparing the 2, marking up my book here just to get a good sense. Yeah. Okay. Are there any questions before we continue on now?
Yeah, I had an understanding that the avoda of Shem Van is Beseder V'Hadraga. The Hamshacha from the Avodah of Shemban is the Seder Hadraga. It's a step-by-step process. I thought you had said in your summary that it was some bigger leap, but I thought that work from below
there's
is
two elements to it. It's correct, but there's a qualitative shift from Yesh to Ayin. That's why I read from the page. If you go back to the page I just read, he explains it has two parts to it. One is there's the orderly progression, but then it has a qualitative shift because it's doing something that Shema does not do. That is from the bottom up, shifting a fundamental change of Yesh to Ayin. And that's where it touches the Etzem. So it's not a contradiction. They're both correct. Remember, be practical. A person has to grow step by step by step. There's no way around that. That is exactly what Avodah is about.
Right.
It's all progressive. But the question is, Shema, the tzaddik, doesn't have quite that radical paradigm shift. Let's put it that way. That the Berurim do, as he explains on page 1301.
Thank you.
Okay. 29. So one thing, we could be partners. This since Ayin Beis, as we're going to see at some point, does not conclude. The Rebbe Rashab did not end Ayin Beis, whatever the reason is. So I want to ask you to help me with something here. I've been doing it, but maybe you can notice it as well. As we go through it, there's going to be hints to things that the Rebbe Rashab says I'll discuss later. And some of it he does discuss later, some of it he doesn't. So in my own mind, I'm trying to also anticipate that based on the things he's telling us about what he's going to discuss later, maybe we could fill in some of the picture when we conclude Ayin Beis to see what's missing based on what the Rebbe Rashab said he will explain. To me, it's very clear now that the next section, Ayin Beis, comes to explain another dimension in the interface. The interface so far we talked about is mostly from the bottom up, the transformation from darkness to light, from Yesh to Ayin, Shemban, and everything we talked about. Obviously, part of that is also understanding how it comes from the top down. We learned about the tzaddik, Shema. We learned about different ways of sweetening the water, the bitter water, not just from the bottom up. So we've cleared that. So I've so far noticed a few things that the Rebbe Rashab said. That one is, so wherever you see that he says something, I'll explain later. If you don't mind, mark it down, and then we could all collect it together. I mean, I'll do it as well, but the more heads we put together, we may be able to figure out some of the puzzle when the need will come, when some things, when it's concluded and we don't have all the details. But as I said, it's clear that he's going to finish that. Now, it's interesting as well, before we continue on, Ayin Beis began actually Mamayla Lamata, not Mamata Lamayla. If you start from Ayin Beis in the beginning, even though he talks about spheres and he talks about Mamala Kalam and talks about the energy within existence, but the early parts, he talks very much about the 10 hidden spheres and how they are in the highest levels, the root of existence and the root of the structure, even in the highest levels. And as I explained, in Ayin Samach Vav, he talks much more about divesting ourselves of the structure of existence. Ben Shanasa Eved. The Ben is a Ben, and he's similar to, and he's a piece of his father, of godliness. When he becomes an Eved, he's divesting himself of the Giluyim to connect to the Etzem through Yigiyah, through hard work and through Kabbalah Sale, through accepting the yoke. In Ayin Beis is a lot more. The discussion is, like we're going to learn Torah, to bring the Eved Shanasa Ben, that Atzmizdika connection, that core connection should also come into Giluyim, that we also experience it. So big part of the early Ayin Beis was a lot about the Giluyim. And then in middle of volume 2, the Rebbe Rashab started going downward from the highest levels before the Tzimtzum to the Kav, and then into Ak and Atzilus, and then into Biyah, below the Tzimtzum and below the Parsa, the partition. That even that can be transformed. And then he went to the whole discussion from the bottom up. So in a sense, you can say that the beginning of Ayin Beis was much more about, I can't say from the top down per se, but he did speak about it that way. And then he went to the bottom and went from the bottom up. And now he's going back, which seems to be the final section of Ayin Beis, which will be the third section. If we go with that approach, then now he's going back to Torah from the top down. Now that we've developed the work from the bottom up, now there's something through Torah we can draw down energy that our effort alone would never have accessed. even though the effort reaches the etzem and it reaches very high levels, but then there's something about Torah, which is God telling us about himself. This is like he said on the bottom of page 1348. He said, there's the kalim that create an image in the oir, and then there's the oifena oir, am tmunas hakeli, kumesh yizbar be'ezes Hashem yizbarach be'inyan ha-Torah. So Torah is going to give us a picture, not just how we see it and how we bring God into our lives from the bottom up, but how it comes from the top down. So I just thought it's interesting to put it into the context. This is really comes only from learning the whole Ayin Beis. There's no way, I learned Ayin Beis a number of times before we started this year 10 years ago, but I never saw the picture develop until I really learned it in this depth, because then I suddenly see the whole thing emerging in this way. And it comes back to the Tu'ay Ramimcha L'Kai HaMelech, which is so critical here, from the bottom up and from the top down. And also explains ultimately what Tefillah does and what Torah does, what Avodah Mamata L'Mayla does from the bottom, and what Torah does, what it provides us, as we discussed, because at the end of the day, what would life be if God never gave us the Torah, God forbid? If he only gave us, he said, okay, you have a soul, daven to me, and reach as much as you can reach. But there was a matan Torah. Torah gave us something. Torah gave us essentially a blueprint of God's mind, a CAT scan of God's mind and what God wants of us. And it could only have been given by God. We could never have figured out the Torah through our own effort. We could have figured out how to connect and we could work on ourselves. But the Torah ultimately gives us something, and that's what we're going to be learning now. So it's like the image of existence as God sees it. So there's a value. So what we've been learning is Das Tachten from the bottom perspective going upward. And now Das Elyon, how the Torah provides us with a picture. And when you combine both, then you have the best of both worlds. Okay. Now I'm thinking about it. V'yadaita ayim v'shavesa levavecha is our avodah. V'yadaita, you shall know today, v'shavesa, and you shall take it to heart. Ki Hashem ulakim. Okay, that's the avodah, level by level. Let me just see one thing here. And then which of course is the ultimate transformation from the bottom up. Then there's another pasuk in Torah called Ata Hareisa Ladas. And back in volume 2, in the Maimer of Shavuos, he made it clear that that is I, Ata, you, God, Hareisa, have revealed yourself for us to know you. That's not Mamata Lamayla. That's Mamayla Lamata. It just came to me, interestingly. Let me just see. I want to just see it inside. I'm looking at the Shavuos Maimer in Ayin Hay. 1 second. Tell you what page it is. Yeah, I think it's page 996. Yeah, says it clearly. After this, abderch mamayla lamata, and v'yadaita is mamata lamayla. That may be a hint, because that means that the Torah after this is God revealing Himself to us. Yeah, bottom of 996 and on top of 997. I think that may be a key to a lot of what we're going to learn. Okay, we shall see. Okay, with that.
Which specific language?
I just read the page on 996 and 997 with Mamayla Lamata, Mamata Lamata. From the top down or the bottom up? Yeah. So though we only have a few minutes here, I'll begin on top of page 1350. So after all these introductions, so now that we've covered the bottom up, he's going to start on top of 1350. He says, now that we covered tefillah, prayer, which is from the bottom up, us crying out to heaven. Now we need to understand what is Torah. Shehi b'bchinas hamshacha mamayla lamata. That's hamshacha, not lamata. It's not a halah, elevating from the bottom up. That's a transmission from the top down. Ma'ayin liyesh, not from yesh to ayin, from ayin to yesh. Ayin meaning a more sublime state. That's called ayin compared to yesh, which is a more tangible and concrete state. Shariatei b'chinas shema, the chachma. Because Torah is the level of shema, of chachma. Chachma, remember, is koyach ma, the power of what? Bittul ma. Shezeh b'chinas ayin. When you say what, it's like ayin. I don't know what it is. It's a mystery. It's like ma. It's intangible. Ubesharsha, and its root, what is the level? He b'chinas chachma hagduma da'ak. Is the primordial level of wisdom of ak, of Adam Kadme. B'chinas atzmi shema, the core of shema. If you recall, that was the level that he referred to, that Mashiach will reveal, which will cause the neshamas of ma, the tzaddikim, to do tshuva, because when they get the etzem of shema, not just a taste of it, not just a piercing, bikiyah, like on the forehead, they only see the glow, but the actual revelation. So that is when they'll recognize their inadequacy, because they'll see that high level. But that's all high levels of revelation. Atzmi shema. Shu b'chinas ayin ha'atzmi. So in ayin itself, you have ayin. Ayin means above the yesh, more sublime. But ayin ha'atzmi, just like we talked about helam ha'atzmi, is the core state of ayin. What's the ultimate core, intangible state, abstract state, or state that is not that is sublime? Is chachma of ak. Atzmi shema, ayin ha'atzmi. That's the root of Torah. So Torah is revealing to us the godly energy that's beyond yesh. Tefillah and for Aveda below, we are yesh. And from the yesh, we climb and we transform ourselves into becoming containers for the divine, for the ayin. Here, we're getting Abshachah from Torah the other way around. It's the Shema, all the way from Etzem of Shema, coming downward. If you want to know the page where he talked about Atzmi Shema, I can give it to you. It's right here. So the bottom, when he talked about Shuvah, so he said like this. The bottom of page 1343 is where it was mentioned. Okay. So, and the Torah, this level, all the way from the Ayin Atzmi, from Chachma Vak, was drawn, extended itself from the top down. That it became a mitzias. We have a Torah, as he says in Tanya, in chapter 5, he says the Torah Nasa v'Yarda. The Torah traveled from Chem de Gnuza. The Gemara says it was called a hidden treasure of God's in the highest levels. Shashim lefonav, it's God's delights. It's God's Torah, but it came down from the level of Ayin, was given down by Yered Hashem al Har Sinai. God came down on Mount Sinai and gave the Torah to earth. Torah doesn't belong in heaven. It was given to earth down below. Became a Mitzias. So therefore, Harizema Ayin liyesh. So the process is from a state of sublime to a state of tangibility and concreteness in the material world, from to yesh. Who says the Rebbe Rashab, and this is that Ayin ha'atzmi. There's this highest level of ayin, of sublime. I'm just using the word sublime because there's other words for ayin. Ayin means nothingness, but he means nothingness in compared to somethingness of the substance of existence. That means that the ayin ha'atzmi b'chinas yeshu mitzias. The highest level of Ayin Atzmi has now come manifest in a Yesh Mitzias that we can not just touch, but we can learn and understand and relate to. That's Torah. That's a fundamental description of what Torah essentially is. The wisdom and will of God as it's come down into the state of a Yesh, into this world. So this is Uma'at Tzarech Love, and so now we need to understand the role of Torah and how it plays a role and what an impact it has on our lives. Now keep in mind, before we learn tzaddikim and balei tshuva, or the neshamas of Atzilus and the neshamas of Biyah, the neshamas of Ma, the neshamas of Ban, so there too, those neshamas of Ma are more mamayil lamata. But that's in general the souls. That's their process of aveda, because they're agents of light. They essentially come from the world of light, whereas neshamas the Ban come from the world of concealment. So the concept of from the top down and bottom up we've learned, but now we're talking about Torah. Everybody was given Torah. Neshamas the Ban also have Torah. So it's true, tzaddikim, you can say, have more of amshachim amayil lamata because they identify with godliness. That's what we said earlier. That's why they don't have what a Baal Tshuva has. A Baal Tshuva is the only one that came from a darkness. A tzaddik, even when he does tshuva, it's not coming from real darkness, he said. It's coming from a darkness relative to his state. He's feeling inadequacy compared to the highest levels of godliness. But you can't compare it to true darkness. But now we're explaining for all neshamas. Torah was given to everyone. Torah is not just for tzaddikim or neshamas the ma. So basically, like he said earlier, just as tzaddikim ma have ban within them, ban has ma within them, but especially through Torah. Now, if you may recall, he actually said it explicitly when he said on page 1344, he said, Gam b'bal tshuva yesh b'chinas shema, because the tshuva, they also have a neshama, and they also have following Torah mitzvahs, and they're grounded. He clearly said that Torah, they have Torah, that Torah comes from Shema, what he says here now. So he's already mentioned this point, but now is going to be a full elaboration. What exactly is Torah and the Shema that it brings into our lives? Basically, a taste of godliness on God's terms, not the way we experience godliness from us, from within us, which has all the qualities we spoke about. As a matter of fact, has qualities that Shema doesn't have. That's why a mitzvah or tshuva, or from the bottom up, has something even Torah doesn't have. That's why tshuva is considered higher than Torah, as we learned as well earlier. But you can't take away, Torah has the mile of Oir. And remember, Oir gives us a taste of godliness, a taste of what the divine is like on all levels. Keli and Yesh gives us a taste of Etzem, but Oir gives us a taste of revealed godliness. So we want to have both, the best of both worlds. I'm going to stop here because now he's going to start. He's going to say Biure Inyan, and he's going to explain how this. He's going to start with the whole pasuk. That's now going to develop into a whole subject matter. So you could literally say that a chapter in Ayin Beis has ended at the bottom of page 1349, and a new chapter began in 1350. I say chapter, it's not a new book. It's a new chapter because it's a new subject, but it's all in the context of the interface. It's just now we're going from the Mamad Lamata, and I said it's very clear that he's going back to initial themes that he spoke about much earlier, just as he was doing before, but now in that context through Torah Mamad Lamata. Okay, so we enter the new section, and I will stop here, take questions, and we're ready to embark on the next leg of the journey. As I said, this will go till page 1479. We're now 1350. Talking about 129 pages. Yeah. And that will then, that's what Ayin Beis concludes. So in this long journey, we have another 129 pages. Yeah. Okay, any questions? All good? Okay, so I'm going to stop here, stop the recording here. Top of page 1350, basically 6 lines in.